Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Friday Ramblings. We're here once again to discuss all things pop culture-y, entertainment-y, and just plain fun. Today we're going to sit there and we're going to do something that, well, is going to be a bit of a history lesson, a bit of a business lesson, but also involves video games. That's right, we are going to discuss Atari. Why? Well, because there is currently a company called Atari. However, the company currently called Atari is not the same company that used to be called Atari that produced some of the most iconic games of the early video game or home video game release, if not arcade game release, generation. Your Pongs, your Pac-Mans. Well, no, Pac-Man was Namco. Excuse me. But your Pongs, your infamous E.T., your Pitfalls. Yep. All those lovely games. Many more, but really, we're not going to sit there and try to name off every great and iconic Atari game, because there's so many. But that company no longer exists. That company has not existed for a few decades. But there has always been somebody named Atari in the video game business. This is what we're going to break down today, folks, because this comes down to a matter of understanding the business world. Specifically, that you can purchase a company's name, their reputation, and use it for your company or to create a new company. This is commonly referred to as intellectual property. But more importantly, the fun part is you can not only buy the name to use for a new company, you can buy the name and then apply it to your already existing company, thus making it appear like a brand new company to the casual viewers. Tuck on my massive mane of hair back here so I look nice and professional for this business discussion. You know, I've got a little dirt here on the chin. A little fuzz. But hey, what can you say? I'm rugged. Going back to what we were discussing, now that I've sat there and made a fool of myself, as I tend to do it very often. But this is the nature of the business world. Basically, you can do anything if you know what paperwork to fill out, what steps to do in what order, and, more importantly, when to spend a little bit of money. Because it is business, and business is all about spending money at the end of the day. Sometimes at the beginning of the day, too. Usually not midday, because that's when you're doing your lunch meetings and you're discussing how you're going to spend your money, so. But that's what it all comes down to. If you have the money and you have the patience, more importantly, you have the money to pay a guy to have the patience to do all that paperwork, you can take a company that's already built up an established reputation, you can take its name and you can put it on your company. Or you can make a new company. Or sometimes you can make your company and make it into two companies. Oh, so like you put the name on one company. Well, no, you put the name on both branches. What? Yeah, this is all going to be a fun breakdown. This is going to be a little bit similar to the video we just did last week about women's championships and how they would branch off and split off and get renamed. It's a similar process. But it's about the video game industry. And it's about companies trying to live off the good reputation and the good PR of an existing company, because let's face it, for those of us who are older gamers, Atari has a lot of nostalgia value. My first home console was an Atari. I remember playing Pitfall and Miss Pac-Man and Pong on it. I've since in my older years gone back and played other Atari games. So, you know, it means a lot to me. Oh, and yes, as I have stated before on a couple of the different shows that me and my partner have done over the years, I think we just did it more recently when discussing video games on our Generation eXpletive show, cross promotion. I have in fact played the infamous E.T. Never beat it, never really understood it as a child, but I enjoyed messing around with it. But that's a different subject for a different time. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Now, the original Atari Corporation was founded in Sunnyvale, California in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. Ted Dabney was an electrical engineer and provided a lot of the genius know-how in assembling circuit boards that brought games like Pong to life. Nolan Bushnell is a master of startup companies, Atari being his second. His third may be one that you, especially if you're my age, have heard of, and that is called Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theater. Yep, that's right, the old Cheester himself. The chain that, along with Showtime, helped inspired the now infamous Five Nights at Freddy's games, most blatantly the first one, was started by the same guy that started Atari. Now, Nolan Bushnell has started a couple dozen other companies since, usually trading on his infamy as an investor to help gain interest in the companies, making sure they get started before stepping back and letting the younger people run them. And I'm not picking on Nolan Bushnell. I'm sure he's a very intelligent man who's taken a lot of good care of his mind and body, but he was born in 1943. He has been with us on this planet Earth for a little bit of time. There is no shame in that. There's actually much respect. I have all the props in the world for those who have come before me, especially those who have blazed trails like Nolan Bushnell has. The man is quite literally a Hall of Famer in the consumer electronics industry. But, again, we're not here to praise Nolan Bushnell. We're here to praise the company he started. Actually, not even praise it, explain what happened to it. So, as I said, Atari started in 1972 in Sunnyvale, California. It was officially known as Atari Inc. Inc., of course, being short for Incorporated, referring to the legal setup of the company. Woo! And they had 12 good years. Unfortunately, in 1984, as a result of the video game crash of 1983, which is extensively documented by dozens and dozens of people. If you are not familiar with what the video game crash of 1983 is, the short of it is that a series of poorly received and low-selling video games, E.T. taking the brunt of the public perception damage, although it was not alone in that by far, caused Atari and the couple other video game companies that were producing consoles and software to take huge financial hits. Woo! The video game crash would later be recovered from, thanks primarily to the efforts of Nintendo, although Sega, as a producer of software, especially for arcade systems, did a lot to help with that recovery as well. They didn't really start kicking butt in the console market until the Genesis, which came years later. That's another subject for another video, though. Still, as we said, 1984, 12 years after, Atari had its first corporate restructuring game, in which the original Atari Inc. was split. The arcade division was turned into Atari Games Inc. Atari Games received the rights to use the logo and brand name with the appended text Games on their arcade games, as well as rights to the original arcade hardware properties. The other half of Atari, which became known as the Atari Consumer Electronics Division, was in turn sold to Jack Tramiel's Tramiel Technology Limited, which then renamed itself to Atari Corporation. Jack Tramiel is a Polish-American businessman and Holocaust survivor, best known for founding Commodore International. Its most famous product being the Commodore 64. We'll talk Commodore another time, I swear. So, there's that. The renamed Atari Corporation was then, 12 years later, woohoo, in 1996, reverse merged with disk drive manufacturer JT Storage, aka JTS, becoming a division within the company. 2 years later, in 1998, Hasbro Interactive acquired all Atari Corporation related properties from JTS, creating a new subsidiary, Atari Interactive. But wait, we're still not done. Infogrames Entertainment bought Hasbro Interactive in 2001 and renamed it Infogram Interactives, which intermittently published Atari-branded titles, alongside, of course, the Infogrames brand as well. In 2003, it renamed that division Atari Interactive. So the Atari Interactive name kind of went in a cycle there, folks. And another Infogrames Entertainment division, Infogrames Inc., which was originally GT Interactive, keep up, changed its names to Atari Inc. the same year, which means that is the second Atari Inc., licensing the Atari name and logo from its fellow subsidiary. In 2008, Infogrames Entertainment completed its acquisition of Atari Inc.'s outstanding stock, making it a wholly owned subsidiary, and Infogrames Entertainment renamed the entire corporation into Atari SA in 2009, where I believe it is still running. Let me check real quick here. Doop 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 boop boop doop 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 doop. All right. So yes, Atari SA is still in business. However, in 2013, they did seek bankruptcy protection under French law, where the company is headquartered, and its subsidiary in the United States subsequently sought Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection as well. All three subsidiaries have since exited bankruptcy and are all going through a vigorous turnaround campaign, which is where we're at right now. So, more power. Real quick, let me do this. So, let's rewind back again though, folks. Remember we had said the original arcade division became Atari Games Inc. So what happened to that? Well, here's where we're going to have some fun. Let's go trace what happened here. Woo! Now, it should be noted that when Jack Tramiel bought the Consumer Products Division, it was actually done by Time Warner, who had obtained Atari just before the split. Warner Communications had obtained Atari shortly before the video game crash. Sorry, I kind of messed up my timeline notes there, but so, as we said before, though, Time Warner retained the coin-op division, renaming it Atari Games. Doop-a-doop-a-doop-boop. And most of those employees and managers that had worked at the original Atari Inc. moved to Atari Games. In 1985, the controlling interest of Atari Games was sold to Namco, who soon lost interest in operating an American subsidiary. Namco, we mentioned earlier, created Pac-Man, and in more recent years has also created the Tekken franchise. We like Namco. We like Tekken. We like Pac-Man too, along with the many other properties they've created, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. Still, as of right now, that means one half of the original Atari branching is owned by Namco as of 1985. In 1987, though, Namco sold its shares partly back to Warner and partly to a group of employees led by then-President Hideyuki Nakajima. Atari Games continued to manufacture arcade games and units, and starting in 1988 also sold cartridges for the NES under the Tengen brand name, including an infamous version of Tetris. Companies exchanged a number of lawsuits in the late 1980s related to disputes over the rights to Tetris and Tengen's circumvention of Nintendo's lockout chip. The lockout chip was one of the things Nintendo did to try and avoid a repeat of the video game crash of 1983. The idea being that while various companies could design software for the Nintendo Entertainment System, that it would have to pass Nintendo's approval before they would print it. They would not print something just because you made something for them, which was how that early era of video games worked. Pretty much anything that was programmed would be put out to market because nobody had any real idea of what gamers wanted yet. This is where the famous Nintendo seal of quality stamp came from. Now, how did they prevent people from just designing their own physical cartridges? That's where the lockout chip came in. Tengen found a way around the lockout chip, though, along with a couple other companies, but Tengen was the earliest, and the fact that they were a subsidiary of Atari made them one of the largest to pull this attempted break of etiquette. I know you're asking, well, why did they make a subsidiary? Well, it's very simple. One of the ways that Nintendo encouraged people to make quality games was by limiting the number of games they could publish on the NES every year. The idea being, if you're going to make 5 games instead of 10, and I am pulling these numbers out of my head as hypotheticals, those are not the actual exact numbers in the contracts. But the idea is that theoretically, if you were making 5 games, or previously you had made 10, you would spend twice as long working on the games and verifying that they had as few bugs and glitches as possible, as well as being as fun to play as possible. Now, personally, I kind of agree with that theory. Don't flood the market with inferior product. That is the core of what led to the video game crash. But a few companies worked around that by creating subsidiaries so that, again, picking on this, Atari would make 5 games for the NES, and then Tengen would make 5 games for the NES, but it's ultimately the same company operating under 2 different brand names. I know, we're doing a sidestep here, but it's a thing. Now, the suit file reached a settlement in 1994 with Atari Games paying Nintendo cash damages and use of several patent licenses. That's a whole nother subject. But the idea is that they eventually folded up the 10-gen brand when it kind of became toxic due to bad public perception. Now, in 1989, meanwhile, Warner Communications merged with Time Inc., forming Time Warner. And in 1993, Time Warner reacquired the controlling interest in Atari Games and made it a subsidiary of its Time Warner Interactive division. I think we dealt with them before, didn't we? Yes, we did. Well, the company initially maintained the Atari Games brand for arcade games under the new ownership. The 10-gen brand was dropped in favor of the Time Warner Interactive label, which we had mentioned a moment ago. And in mid-1994, the Atari Games, 10-gen, and Time Warner Interactive names were all consolidated under the Time Warner Interactive banner. Which means Atari Games still existed as a business, but it had now been renamed Time Warner Interactive. For 2 years. In April 1996, after an unsuccessful bid by Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell, the company was sold to WMS Industries, owner of the Williams, Bally, and Midway arcade brands, which restored the use of the Atari Games name. According to Atari Games president Dan Van Elderen in 1995, Time Warner decided to exit the video game business and instructed the management at Atari Games to find a buyer for themselves, which surprised him because usually parent companies choose a buyer for their subsidiaries. So, that means, yes, folks, they got rid of the Atari Games label, but 2 years later sold the business to a company that was already in the video game business, who then cycled it back and restored the Atari Games name. Just like we had on the other side of the Atari branch. Isn't this fun? So on April 6, 1998, the video game assets of WMS Industries were spun off as a new independent company called Midway Games, which gained control of the Atari Games division. However, because of what we discussed earlier, on that branch, this is the branch we've been at in the last couple minutes, this is the branch we discussed earlier. Remember that whole thing about Hasbro Interactive reviving the Atari name for the consumer's game market? Well, guess what? Neither company really wanted to sit there and have dueling Atari companies, so Atari Games, only 1 year later, was renamed Midway Games West. Thus, the Atari Games name would no longer be used. Flash forward 2 years, in 2001, Midway Games exited the arcade industry due to a decline in the market. At least here in America, arcade games are still huge, in Asia, especially Japan. But again, that's another subject for another time, just a little FYI to throw your way. However, despite this, Midway Games West continued to produce games for the home console market until it was disbanded on February 7, 2003, after a slump in game sales. Although no longer in operation, Midway Games West continued to exist as a holding entity whose primary function was to be the copyright and trademark owner for its properties. Which means, yes, folks, they spent several years existing only to make sure nobody else was ripping them off. That is actually not that unheard of in the big corporate world. Holding companies are a thing. It happens. When you have really old famous copyrights and trademarks, you do not want to have nobody watching out for them and protecting them, because otherwise you do not make money off something you should be making money off of. All this leads to February of 2009 when Midway Games filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Hey, we come up with that old buddy again, Chapter 11. And in July 2009, most of Midway's assets were sold to Warner Brothers Interactive Entertainment. Oh, Warner keeps coming up. Everything's just circles. It just keeps going back in along itself. Companies bouncing in and out of the equation like they're on trampolines. Ultimately bringing all of the Atari game properties back to Time Warner again. The entity, however, still existed for other legal reasons until October 2nd, 2013, when it was finally dissolved for good. So, that means currently we have one Atari. Atari SA, which used to be Infogrames Entertainment. However, they have played their own little name game roulette with the company over the years and have themselves had to face potential financial shutdown and extinction. So, the good news is you only have one Atari currently producing content. But we went from a handful of eager young American programmers led by an incredible businessman named Nolan Bushnell, who manages to constantly find a way to reinvent himself and reinvest in the consumer electronics industry, including in more recent years, fronting companies specifically designed around creating interactive products to help people maintain brain health in their older age. That is definitely something that people should appreciate and take seriously. As I said, we may do an episode on Nolan Bushnell in the future. Sadly, he took his eye off the ball with Chuck E. Cheese, and that company is, been limping along for several years, and thanks to 2020 Corona shutdowns, it's looking like his former company and its mousy mascot may be facing the final shutdown. Still, it's been a fun journey. I hope you tune back. I hope you... Woo! That's what happens when you throw so much stuff out all at once. Your tongue gets tied. Okay, got the knot out. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you tune in next week when we will have another subject. We will not be video game related. It will not be Nolan Bushnell yet. It will not be about Jack Trammell. It will not be about Infogrames. However, it will be about more fun with names bouncing around. That's right, we're going back to comic books and we're going back to legacy identities. That's all I'm going to tell you for now. You're going to have to tune in next week to see what specific characters we're going to break down as they share code names. For now, the moral of the story for this episode is just because your company hits financial problems doesn't mean your company's place in history is going to go away. You could get bought out. You could become a subsidiary. You could just plain find that your name becomes the name for somebody else. They could then split up. They could get bought out. And then the other side get bought out. And then bounce back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Seriously, this is some trampoline business. This company buys it now. This company buys it. Well, this company buys it again. Well, this company buys and splits and flips and shuts down and gets bought out by this guy and woo! One more for you, folks. If you're wondering why you have heard the name Midway Games before, I got two words for you. Mortal Kombat. That's right, folks. Yeah, that's where you know Midway Games from. Mortal Kombat! among some others. Who knows? I may tackle them, although personally, I got a little bit of a beef with the Mortal Kombat franchise. Not just them, but they are a major sinner in this. That may be a future video as well. I do like the fighting game franchise. We referenced Namco's Tekken earlier. And of course I have done a previous video on the mini games under Capcom's Street Fighter branding. You should watch that video. It's in our archives. For quick reference, we have a wonderful Friday Ramblings playlist. But for now, we're not going to talk about the sins of the fighting genre. We're not going to talk about Atari anymore, because there's separate nights and separate ramblings where we can break down the legacy of the specific Atari games. Heck, that may be something that I may join my partner with on an episode of Generation eXpletive. See, you need to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the shows we do, because since it's two schmucks doing the same stuff across all the shows, things zip in and out and they cross over and tangle together. So you gotta watch it all. And you won't miss a single thing if you subscribe. Throw some comments down below. Like. Tell your friends. Heck, tell your enemies if you really think my stuff sucks so you can torture them. Works for me. And I'll be back to ramble again in 7 days. Bye-bye.